Hey, it's Greg Stanley. If you're listening to this podcast, you know I love everything automotive. This passion has expanded to include being a car specialist consultant for RM Sotheby's. So if you need assistance buying or consigning a collector car at any one of our online or live auctions, including Scottsdale, Amelia Island, or Monterey, you can reach one of our car specialists at rmsotheby's.com, or you can email me directly at gstanley@rmsotheby's.com.
This is the Collector Car Podcast, the home for the auto enthusiast. Join Greg Stanley as he applies over 25 years of insights and analytical experience to the collector car market. He will interview the experts and throw in some fun stuff as well.
Hey, it's Greg Stanley with the Collector Car Podcast. We have another cool episode this week talking about cars a lot of us don't know about, a lot of the fabulous fiberglass cars from the 1950s. And to help me understand these cars a little bit more, I'd like to welcome Geoff Hacker and Guy Dirkin. How you guys doing?
Hey, doing well.
Good, Greg. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And the reason I wanted to cover this topic, and it might be future topics, some more episodes in the future for the podcast, is just it's a fascinating era of automotive history that a lot of folks don't know about, and it involves really cool special cars that are really kind of one-off, one of a kind, rare and special. So I thought, Geoff, if you would, could you just kind of give us an overview of these cars in general? I know that's asking a lot, but you're the expert. You run a website called Undiscovered Classics. And could you just give us kind of a 101 for some of my listeners that might not know more about or that would like to know more about these cars?
Yeah, I'm working on a phrase, kind of evolving it a bit. And I was this morning with Guy Dirkin a bit also. And I used to say kind of comically, we specialize in finding cars no one's looking for, which kind of has a humorous and got you to laugh as well, which is funny. But the actuality is that back in the day, these were the cars people were talking about. These were the cars that were the headlines in the shows, the Peterson Motorama shows, not General Motors, but Peterson, which was just as big. These were on the cover of magazines. In fact, I added up all the covers of magazines showing hand-built, handcrafted cars done by small companies or individuals, and that's really what we focus on. And there are more covers in the 1950s of magazines showing the cars that we study than there are cars of the Corvette and the Thunderbird, which came later in the 50s, but certainly were well-respected and very exciting for the public to see. So these were the bomb. These were how exciting. These were the things that got your imagination going. These were, look what Detroit is building. I'm going to build a concept car too. I'm going to build a sports car. I'm going to build a sporty car. I'm going to build, in some cases, a horrible car. They're not all perfect, but I can remind your listeners, and Guy would agree, they're not all perfect out of Detroit either, aren't they? You know, we could name some, what were they thinking kind of cars, which I love, by the way, out of Detroit too. But not everyone was a winner, but far more were winners, like some of the ones we'll talk about later, than not. We started this off 2007 with no mission. You know, we started off with the love of cars. My friend Rick DeLuey and Rick DeLuey sadly passed a number of years ago. But we started off just being very excited and enthusiastic car guys. I had Cadillacs when I was growing up, Cadillacs like ones you pull out and restore from the 50s and 60s, not anything extravagant from the 30s. And other cars, I still have a Kaiser Dragon, for example. But after a while, some of us, maybe Greg is included, or certainly Guy, you start seeing the same cars at the shows, and you love them, but you start becoming an expert, not because you want to, but because you have to. And you don't see where are the new cars? And you start looking at Japanese cars, and you start looking at European cars. And well, what about American cars? What about hand-built American cars of original design? That's what was happening in the 50s. One-off or low-volume cars being built as a cottage industry, mostly in Southern California, but throughout the country. In Chicago, there was a car called the Chicagoan. It was a big hit in the 1954 Chicago Auto Show, and much to my surprise, the biggest car show for manufacturers in the 50s wasn't Detroit, but it was actually Chicago. That was the premier, long-term, well-respected, and it still is today. So there were companies like Kaiser who would not show anything in Detroit, their Detroit show. They would show only at the Chicago Auto Show, which was a little further away. And that's where in 1954, our Chicagoan appeared along with other concept cars. In Florida, there were some small manufacturers, but in the 60s, there were a manufacturer out of St. Petersburg, Florida called the Tiburon, or Covington Tiburon. And that's what I found when I was, August something 1980. That's how long I've had the car, because I keep looking at the bill of sale. It's the one we've taken to Amelia once or twice, Amelia Island Concours. And we're honored to have that car. It's original design. It was on the cover of magazines as well, and then it disappeared. And that's the part, and I may ask Guy here to chip in and speak to the forgotten part, because that's the part that is intriguing. These were top-notch, really famous, well-known cars that just disappeared, and it took our knowledge of it in a car culture forgot. And then they were kind of reintroduced as oddities or weird, and they're not. I guarantee you, none of these designers said, you know what, I'm 50 years from now, I want someone to find my car and think it's the weirdest thing they've ever seen. That's not how it came out. They actually were trying to design something for the era, and some of them, which we'll talk about later, like the Byers SR100, hit it out of the park, and others didn't. I would never profess that cars and handcrafted are the bomb, are the thing that everyone should look for. But I also wouldn't profess that everything coming out of Detroit meets that same standard. So you pick and choose. You pick and choose the things that like you, pick and choose the stories you want. And who doesn't like a story of an underdog, a guy in his garage who's going to build a car? Okay, I haven't vacuumed my house this year. When I do, and it's, June? I will celebrate when I do. These guys were building cars. I mean, I would have taken 1 million pictures and had a parade. That's the kind of stuff that these guys were doing, way beyond my level, and that's what we're trying to capture, that spirit, the enthusiasm, the skill level, the success that they had, even if they just did one car. They can stand to the best. But Guy, do you have anything about, because you talked to me a lot about both the rarity and the forgotten aspect of...
you've said many things, and you also use a phrase that I use a lot, which is the mosaic. That prior to the late 1950s, there were indeed a lot of individual and small companies building race cars and sports cars. The 53 Corvette is an exception. The majority of sports and racing cars were built by small companies and individuals. Why did it get lost? It got lost because there wasn't a comprehensive recording of the individuals who built those cars. One of the things, Jeff, I think that you contributed to the automotive genre is that you've put in 15,000 hours, and I'm not pulling that number from nowhere. I'm probably literally estimating you put 15,000 hours of research in over the last 15 to 17 years to document and pull those pieces of the mosaic together. So now we have a picture. We have a picture of an entire car culture that started after the Second World War, when frankly there were not American sports cars in general that existed. So it was dependent upon individuals to come back with those dreams, the cars they'd seen in Europe, servicemen that came back. It was also extremely time-consuming to build bodies out of aluminum and required a higher level of skill. So one of the coincident timing factors in the early 1950s was the beginning of the use of composite bodies, fiberglass. And I want to use, I'm stressing the word composite, because composite bodies are still used on race cars today and high-performance road-going vehicles. So in the early 50s, that made perfect logical sense to build a sports or a racing car out of fiberglass. And people did. And some people bought literally raw fiberglass woven roving mat and resin, and they set about making plaster of Paris molds in their backyard and built them. Others were more sophisticated. They were able to buy bodies from small and emerging body manufacturers, but it was not a kit car. The kit car era was much later, late 50s and definitely into the 60s. Yeah. Mounting a drop-on body as a component on building a race or sports car is quite difficult to do. We've found many unfinished bodies because of that level of difficulties. People bought the dreams. So I think, Jeff, if you're asking me to provide the context, we were playing around with, we look for cars that nobody knows to look for. I think that's the issue, is there is a legitimate reason to study and understand the presence of these cars in automotive history. But until very recently, thanks to your work, that has not been laid out in a comprehensive, coherent way. I'll pass that back to you, Greg, for now.
Yeah, and a lot of great stuff there. And I did want to bring up the timing of the early 1950s. I know that there was a big influence from World War II. You know, the GIs were over there. They sold the two-seat little sports cars. They wanted something like that in the U.S. And I know also the creation of fiberglass. You know, that was a big deal when that occurred. Obviously, I think the Corvette, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, was the first mass-produced fiberglass car. I know there were some earlier ones, but maybe from a pure volume standpoint.
Yeah, the Corvette was the first one. Yeah, there's some debate if you're talking about fiberglass, Greg, or you're talking about American sports car, because there's some discussion about the the Nash Healy as being America's first.
Yeah, no, I was thinking more of the fiberglass, how that hit mainstream, you know, from a large manufacturing perspective.
Yeah,
I guess
the Corvette, and the actual timeline of Kaiser Darren folks are out there. Is the Kaiser Darren announced first? They made 435 fiberglass cars. They were produced just after the Corvette became available. So you have Kaiser Darren for people wanting to love the details. Kaiser Darren made the announcement first, and then Corvette a few months later, and then Corvette came out first, and Kaiser Darren second. But that's all small things. So
yeah. So now, how about from a manufacturing perspective? I know these cars can be from one guy in his garage creating the bodies. What's the scope? Who was like maybe one of the larger manufacturers of these? Was it 100 cars? Was it 150 cars? Was it 20 cars? Like what kind of, from the one guy to the large kind of brand? What's the scope we're looking at here?
I'll start, and Guy will have. Well, actually, Guy, you start because I'll fill in the details. Why don't you name two or three that you?
In starting into this, Jeff, I think Greg's question is extremely important.
Okay.
What would be your estimate of the total number of small company and individual cars built between 1950 and the late 1950s?
I love that question because it seems insurmountable. How do you get at that in 2005 or 6? And it seems an impossible thing to, and that's when I started, 2005 or 6. And the answer is most of these guys were alive. Bill Burke, in his 90s, actually I talked to Merrill Powell from Victress last night. He's 91. Guy has a car, Victress as well. We just talked to the builder of that car a few weeks ago. He's 97, I think, or 98. Wow. I mean, I don't know, fiberglass seems to have made people live longer. A lot of them have passed away since. I had a chance to ask them all because I love the question I had with Bill Burke. Bill Burke is the father of the belly tank. We built a replica belly tank. You'll see it in the book that you have, Greg. It's number 1 that we built. Bill guided us to build a recreation of the first belly tank streamliner to hit the salt flats, which was El Mirage and so forth out in the out west, the salt flats. So I asked Bill, I said, well, you built these cars later called Allied Swallows, the coupes, and I had 1 or 2, and there were larger versions. How many did you make? I have no idea how I made. Oh, well, then it goes into kind of interviewing, just interviewing skills, and when you're talking to people to get the information out you need. Oh, so you could build, you must have built 500. 500? There's no way we built 500. Well, you built more than 1. How many could you build in a week? Maybe 1 or 2. I said, but, there's the surf out there. Did you guys go surfing? Did you guys go drinking? He said, no, we didn't build. You build 4 or 5 a month. He said, maybe 2 or 3 a month. Well, how long did it last? Okay, those kinds of estimates, because Bill was still very articulate at the time. And then we find things like we found on Victress sale, like 125. This is the 125th body built in 1953 and so forth. And we have access to all the employees that are still around. And the answer is carefully crafted interview, looking for ways in which things might be distorted just by time. And we estimated that the body manufacturers, people, Glasspar, Victress, Wood and Wildfire, and so forth, the ones that made not the Jeff Hacker special, like 1, or the Greg Stanley special, or the Guy Dirkin, but ones that were making with advertisements that could produce bodies and so forth. If you add all those up, you come up with less than 800 bodies ever produced from 52 to 59. And then it gets more interesting is 800 bodies is not 800 cars, is it? Right. So let's say that there's a wild 50% survival rate. We could go different ways. Let's say that 50% of those bodies were made into cars. Okay, it's 800 to 4. Actually, let's go to 1,000. Let's overestimate. So 1,000 bodies became 500 cars. Guy, does that sound reasonable? 1,000 cars became 1,000 bodies became 500 cars. By the way,
I think reasonable but
optimistic. Yes, it's more like 2 or 3. So what I'm doing is I want to show you the point the guy's making, which is rarity. So we're going to say 1,000 bodies, 500 cars. All right. So how many cars were made well, guy? Half? That's
15% of the bodies ever built.
Okay. So, all right. So 15% is guys. I'm going to overestimate too. I'm going to say half of the cars built were built well. Is that right, Guy, or not? They're half the cars.
I'm following the logic. But
all right, so I'm overestimating like crazy. So we start with 1,000, go to 500 cars. 500 cars were built. 250 were built well. Now, built well by our standards today, not built well by their standards today. They would have actually more. They had stick welder. A lot of people look at the welds made back then, and they're like, how could they do that? It's all they had. I remember asking more than one person, how did you cut the frame? What did you use? What kind of, well, we got a hacksaw out. It took us most of a week to cut the frame down with a hacksaw.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? That was not unusual. So these were not for the faint of heart. These took a lot of effort. And if 500 became 250 built nice, how many have survived 70 years later? Because up until recently, I had 120 of them.
Wow. Okay.
All right. So we're talking about rarity. And so, and remember, I overestimated it every step. And sometimes I think Guy and I get off track. These are really, really rare cars. And in some cases, not all cases, they're valuable cars, particularly if they're designed nicely and built nicely and restored nicely. But these are super, super rare. You don't see them at a show. If you have one, you'll be the only one at a show. I'm famous here in Tampa. People driving by my house, I have them out front in my house and also in storage. And no one knows who lives in the yellow house on Memorial Highway, but they certainly know my car's out front.
Yeah. Jeff, I think that at the end of the day, one of the things that we've been very pleasantly surprised about is the invitations to top shows. I mean, you've been to Pebble Beach 3 times?
2 times, and then our car I sold to a friend and a customer. He took it right from our showroom and right out to Pebble Beach, which was
Amelia Island most years.
Oh,
It's because the cars are different. They are ultra rare, but they're different. I can only look at so many 66 Mustang Shelbys, and so on. Anyway, I love Mustang Shelbys, by the way.
Yeah. And I have had Shelbys, but I actually owned 5 Mustangs as I was growing up. So the last one was a Celine that you could have rented at John Wayne Airport, like it was called the Celine B from Budget Rental. I love those, but you see too many of them is the problem for us.
Right. Now, I guess my next question would be, so let's take, I do want to get into a specific car, specifically your Byers, but before we get to that point, so let's say we have, someone, a Victress, they made 100 bodies. Would it always go on the same drivetrain, or would it be up to the owner? Like, how did that work out? Because obviously they're not making drivetrains, and I know, like, Guy, in your example, in your Byers, which we'll get to a minute here, you have a really great 56 Corvette engine in yours, which is really cool. But what was that process? So they buy the body, and they want to make a really nice car. What would be the next step?
Let me take the first part of that, Guy, then I'm going to hand it off to you, okay? Yep. But you'll see what I'm going to say. With all of the companies that produce bodies, they all gave you a choice of chassis. Almost all, actually all of it. I could speak to each one individually. It would be very boring. Each one built different chassis. A company called Curtis, which in the 40s and early 50s was the royalty of American road racing. Indianapolis racing. Built a chassis called the KK500. And it helped standardize everything at 99-inch wheelbase, which is about the size of a Corvette. And companies aligned their cars to that in 1954. So you had choices to buy. I'm going to hand it to you in a second about the build part, Guy, but buy. But you could also, there was more than one company producing chassis, and I would say maybe half of them went for buying the chassis that were available when they bought the body. But there was a very interesting reason that I wanted to share, and then it'll be short. When I was working with Frank Hecox, and he was, that's a new name to Guy. He must have been 90-something. He was an employee for Glasspar. He was explaining to me that when they were starting to sell Glasspars in early 1952, the banks would not give loans to buy a body. and they needed to come up with a chassis so that banks could loan money for a body chassis combination, which was closer to something we call a car. So banks were having a harder time doing it, which I'd never heard since or before or since. He was the only one who talked about this. But one of the reasons to come up with a chassis from a company perspective was you could build a full car with any of these companies. Most didn't. But you could buy a body and a chassis, or you could do what I'll hand it over to Guy is, build something yourself. So Guy?
Yeah, Greg, I know this is, we need to transition to the Byers soon, but I also own a Victress, as Jeff pointed out. It was built by Fred Bodley, the technical editor of Motor Trend. Fred co-owned a business as a Rolls-Royce mechanic. So the Victress that I have was built on a modified 1940s Ford chassis, Ford flathead, Ford gearbox, Ford rear end. He had to cut down the chassis length and made some adjustments to get the wheelbase under the body. That car is a time capsule of the way things were built in 1953-54, including the ugly stick welding, which we at one point debated, should we grind it down and make it look pretty, but we decided we would leave it exactly the way it was. Right. So that's probably an example of the economic way to build a car. And people built custom chassis from raw steel or modified other cars to go under the same body.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's really great. That's a nice little overview. And I feel like, we've given the listeners a little bit of a snapshot as far as what these cars are, why they came about, who made them, just, overviews. And obviously I want to give a plug, Jeff, to your website, undiscoveredclassics.com, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Yep. Because you have a wealth of information by model, by body style, whatever. You've got a ton of information if people want to dig more into that. Now, I do want to move on to the Byers car. Now, the Byers, it's a 1956 SR 125 Byers. That guy is actually selling at RM Sotheby's June sale, which is occurring here shortly. I believe it's June 23rd till June the 30th. So you can go to rmsotheby's.com and check it out. And I'm going to pull up a picture here. So if you've always listened to me via a podcast, you can go to YouTube and you can check out this in person, and you can see what we're talking about here. Now, I will have to say this Byers is absolutely stunning and gorgeous. If I had to compare it to a car, I would honestly take it to an early 50s Ferrari Barchetta. It's got the egg crate grille, is absolutely gorgeous. This one in particular is a beautiful blue with twin silver racing stripes and gray interior. So, Guy, could you just tell us more about this particular car, what makes it interesting in the world of Undiscovered Classics?
Yeah, sure, I will. And I'll use this as an example as well from to extend on from the previous conversation. So when I bought this car, it was built in period in the late 1950s. It was probably built on the lower end of the technical spectrum. Some of these cars had plywood flooring, for example. This car originally had a Ford chassis that intruded into the seating area. So you would end up sitting on top of the chassis. And that's actually common with some of these cars. You tend to look a bit like a Shriner. And I'm 6'3", so that was difficult for me. This car is powered by a 1956 265 small block Chevrolet engine. It's going through an M21 4-speed transmission into a Ford rear end with limited slip differential. I originally built the car to go vintage racing. And once it was put together, it was so gorgeous that I was very reluctant to actually put this car on the track. There are two roll hoops that come with the car. One is asymmetric, so it would be for driver protection only, as a forward tube that gets bolted to a flat plate in the passenger seat area. Currently, as you see, if you go to the pictures to look at on YouTube, you can see that there are two round circles, which is where you would remove the roll hoop from. In changing this to a track car, for safety reasons and to meet vintage race regulations, I did change the rear of the suspension to a 4-link. This is a very, very flat driving car. And Greg and I have had conversations as if you wanted an absolutely original period car, this is probably not the one to buy. But if you want a car that was built in period, that has a high level of drivability, this is a fantastic car. It really corners well. We kept the tire size exactly the same as matching vintage race car rubber. Should one wish to switch this and go vintage racing, you could do that. I could think of some other details. This is one of the few that actually has the original Corvette windshield, which Jim Byers, when he made the fiberglass bodies for these cars, made a mounting surface to fit that windshield. So a lot of cars of the era, the windshield became an afterthought. This looks like it should be in place. Those are the things that come to mind. I probably missed a whole bunch, but
yeah, and I apologize. I said SR 125. Is that SR 100, correct?
Yeah, SR. So, Jeff, was that street roadster? SR, and then 100-inch wheel.
I had to think about it for a second, right? Because they did a CR also, competition. So
yeah,
SR street roadster.
The 100 depicts
sports
the wheel.
or sports roadster. I have to go back.
Sports roadster, either. Yes, yeah. A couple of other notes about the car. A Byers was featured on the cover of Road and Track magazine, February 1957. And in writing up the article, John Bond, who is the editor, asked the question, is this the world's most beautiful sports car? So whether we could sit here and debate that question for quite a while, given the era, it's clearly one of the more attractive cars of the 1950s. I'm reluctant to sell it, but I'm getting to the point where I've got more cars than I have space, and as you've probably heard many times from other people. Anyway, Greg, did I miss anything?
No, I think it's a 4-speed, correct?
4-speed, yeah.
Yeah, so it's ready to run. Obviously, I mean, like I said, it's a gorgeous 2-seat roadster, and like I said, if I had to compare it to anything, it would have been an early 50s Ferrari. And you got the Corvette 265. That's two quad carbs, correct?
No, this one it's a 500 CFM carburetor. I don't like to overcarburate engines. The engine in this car would need to be changed to a race engine. We could discuss that with future owner. I happen to have one.
Oh, right.
But I've been behind, in my race, a GT1 car, I've been behind a Devon with a similar layout to this. These cars with 500 horsepower go 170 miles an hour.
Wow.
So bear that in mind if you are thinking of converting this to a vintage race car.
Right. Okay, yeah, and as I said before, if someone's interested in this car, they can go to rmsotheby's.com and check it out. It's there live right now. Bidding starts on the 23rd. Jeff, any other comments about this car? And I did want you to just touch base on maybe the 3 cars that you took to Amelia Island, just to give a little snapshot as far as some of the other makes that are out there.
Part of what, there are 2 things I want to add, and Guy can chip in. Most of your viewers have never seen a Byers SR100. Guy, why have most of them not seen a Byers SR100 before?
Yeah, good question. So mine is one of the Jim Byers woven roving original shells, of which he made 25 bodies. And all Byers, and some were made by other companies with top strand matting later on, we're estimating there's probably only 10 in the world, and only 1 or 2, and I would consider mine probably the best, but only 1 or 2 have a high level of restoration.
Yeah, very, very few. There's one hanging out in Japan somewhere, I think, and I've not been able to track it down. They did ship bodies. I knew some of the employees were Byers, and they did ship bodies to other countries. And there's a restored one in Japan, a silver one, which I don't know the language. I can't reach them.
So there were like 10 complete running, driving cars that we know of, approximately?
10 or less. That's what we've agreed on for the option statistics.
Right. Okay. Yeah, super rare.
And Byers did make another car called the CR90, which is very Devon-esque or Ferrari-esque. or at Signorini-esque, whichever you want to do. They're all Italian. And it's a beautiful car, and it's very rare. But you'll see the Byers CR90 out there too. They are different cars, different wheelbases, different tracks and such. The only other thing I'd like to add in 60 seconds or less is the story. And the story about a Byers is the best story in terms of who built it in the 50s. And the reason is Jim Byers, because Jim started out working with Victress. Now, Victress was one of the founding companies, 1952. And he worked with Doc Boy Smith to create the first Victress S1. It's a car that Guy has and a few other people have. I have one or two. But that was the very early car, a very beautiful car. And then Jim, with his experience, met Dick Jones, who created the Meteor in 53. And in 1953, when they built the Meteor, they debuted it at the Peterson Automotive, the Peterson Motorama, which was in Pan Pacific Auditorium, Los Angeles. And they just barely got the car done, and they put a tonneau cover of it, and you could see the structure underneath it, but it was actually in the magazines and so forth, and it was very Byers-esque. And then in 55, Dick Jones, who designed the Meteor and built it with Jim Byers, left to Colorado, and Jim formed his own company, which carried him through the 60s. So Jim has got the longest footprint in any of the 50s. You talk about who are the big names, Jim would be the biggest, Jim Byers, in terms of company breadth and experience and respect and success at all different levels. So it's nice to have that. If you don't know the history of the fiberglass cars, or hand-built cars, this is one of the top guys.
Right. Okay. No, that's great. Yeah. And if you would, could you touch base just on the cars that were at Amelia? I know I looked at the Maverick pretty closely. That was pretty cool. What other cars were there?
Well, we started out as Forgotten Fiberglass years ago, and two of the cars that were out there were fiberglass, and one was steel. We brought three, which I think under our umbrella this year. We brought the Maverick Sportster, which my co-owner friend Tom Chandler and his family brought. It was about a 7-year restoration. And it's beautiful. It's a car that is got 123-inch or 127-inch wheelbase. It's a special body Cadillac, just like you'd see coming out of Fagoni and Falashi, or if I'm pronouncing it, I can never pronounce that right. I wish they'd come up with a shorthand. I wish they'd come up with a Nike swoosh so I could just say something. But you had special body Cadillacs coming out of Europe, and a couple here maybe in Durham, but we had very little coach building going on in the post-war era. And this is a special body Cadillac, and it came with the approval of the drivetrain and chassis from Cadillac directly. And they built 7 back in the day. When we started researching, we found there was 1 in existence. And by the time, as of today, there are 3 in existence. And I owned 2 of them, and now I own half of that one and still the other. But couldn't be more pleased with Tom's success. Tom won an award called the Buddy Palumbo Award for our car, but the reward will reside with him and his excellent job. If you are showing things you should share the press release. Amelia did a beautiful job at putting out a press release for the car. They called it a French boulevardier car, which was a kind of a grand, sporty, big, large luxury car, which was accurate. Second one was the Woodhill Wildfire from a movie called Johnny Dark. We have our affinity is all these hand-built cars. Woodhill built about 100 cars. We tracked down Woodhills and restored 2 or 3 already, and this is the latest one we restored with its new owner, Jack Farr, who is going to go to a museum of his in Crescent, Texas, which is just outside of Dallas. And the Woodhill Wildfire is often called the first production fiberglass sports car. People throw around all different titles. Basically, the only production fiberglass sports cars were Kaiser Darren and Corvette, because there are no 2 Woodhills alike. There's no 2 Glasspars. Every engine change, every frame change, every body change, every carbon. Everything was custom or bespoke, whichever you want to use. So the production cars really reside with General Motors and Kaiser Darren. So but they did make 100, and it was in movies, and the most famous movie of the 50s was Johnny Dark, and we released a 150-page book you can view online for free, all about the Johnny Dark movie with Tony Curtis and Piper Laurie. And it contains the main race in the movie is 8 cars, and one of them is a Woodhill Wildfire, which this one is part of its legacy. It was stolen in the movie and became the race car, and we found it in Sacramento on Craigslist about 2014, and then brought it back here and started the restoration and found a new owner who took it from there, and it's a really cool car. And in black, it's actually kind of low slung, and it came out very nice. Black is such a hard color, and it came out really, really nice. And then the third car makes me smile every time. I have to say, I saw you briefly at Amelia a few weeks ago, right there at my car, called the Fraser Custom. And the 1954 Fraser Custom was a custom-built steel car, and about a third of my cars are steel or aluminum. So Forgotten Fiberglass may be where we start, but it's really more Undiscovered Classics, where all these hand-built cars, they're, we find a lot of steel now. We go after steel, but we don't forget the fiberglass either. So it's all good. But the Fraser Custom is a fully custom car, built in '54. God knows how it survived. It probably survived because it was ignored for all these years.
Right.
My friend Mike Barker found it, but I was searching for the car 10 years. Mike could have told me any time during that 10 years he had the car. He never did. And finally, a couple years, I don't know, about 5 years ago, he saw, I have that car. Of course, I never told him I was looking for it. And we brought it here and gave it a restoration mechanically with JR Speed Shop down in Venice, Florida. And we kept the patina on it, which is kind of cool. I don't know how long the patina will last. It's pretty old. But we may have to restore it, or the new owner may have to restore it someday. Most of our cars can be bought. I can't keep on to everything. I have no desire to be the largest car owner. The new Jeff Hacker Stadium, the whole, don't want any of that. My job is caretaker ambassador. Guy's job with all of this is caretaker ambassador. And there's nothing, the only thing better than taking a own car to a show like Amelia Island and doing all the hard work to show why this car is important and why this car is beautiful and why it should be saved is finding a new owner for it.
Right.
And it's like, because what does that do? It allows me to go out and save another one and do the same thing over and over again. But like Guy alluded to, 15,000 hours, I would choose a different thing if I were trying to just make money.
Right.
Really would.
It is a labor of love for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we do need to wrap up our time together, and I did give you a heads up. There's a little game I like to play at the end here. So, Guy, I'm going to start with you. So,
Okay.
as I said before, this is a game called Keep, Cash, and Crush. So I'll give you 3 cars. You have to pick one to keep forever, one to cash in, and then one to, unfortunately, send to the crusher. Now, I did not want to pick Undiscovered Classics. I thought that would be a little bit too painful. But I did want to pick fiberglass cars. So for both of you, I'm going to pick some fiberglass cars. Now, Jeff, based on what I picked for Guy, you'll probably be able to figure out yours before I even say them, but we'll give it a shot here. So here are your 3 cars. Guy, you ready?
Yep,
You look like you got your pen and paper ready here.
I have.
All right, so the first one is an original Myers-Manx dune buggy.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is one that was mentioned earlier, the Kaiser Darren. I'm a big fan of those cars. They have the unique sliding door into the front fender, which you never see that anywhere else. And then the third car is a Marcos, a 3-liter Marcos.
Okay, I've already got the answer.
Yeah, and I know you'll like that car. So those are the 3 cars. You have to pick one to keep, cash, and crush. You have the Myers-Manx, the Kaiser Darren, and the Marcos, the 3-liter one. So how are you going to go forward?
It was very easy to crush the Myers-Manx.
Oh.
I would cash out on the Kaiser.
Okay.
And I would keep the Marcus because when I lived in England, I would drive my 3000M to work, and another guy coming the other way every day in a Marcus we would wave to each other. And I've always liked those cars, so that's easy.
Well, can you fit in that car?
Probably not without moving the firewall. But
Okay. It's worth it though, right?
yeah.
Well, I made that one a little too easy on you. So the Myers-Manx you would crush. You would keep the Kaiser Darren, which are pretty strong in the marketplace right now, and you would keep the Marcos, right?
Let me add something to that.
Cashing out the Kaiser would be a good thing right now.
Yeah.
Let me add something first. Can I do that, Greg?
Yeah.
The first 10 Myers-Manx were not the normal Myers-Manx, and so a couple of my friends own them. They're actually probably more valuable than the other 2 combined.
Oh yeah,
But-
the first run.
Ah, you know of them. Okay, good. What are they called? They're not. They don't use the whole. Bruce was a friend. I've known him, but everyone knows Bruce. He's passed away sadly not too long ago. But they used components, and composite body was it was like John Bucci's car guy. It was very thick fiberglass. It was structural. So those, I think he made 10, and they're worth like a ridiculous amount of money each of those. I'd actually crush the Kaiser Darren.
Oh, you would, huh?
Oh, in a second. There's 435. I would take all the parts, give them out for free to other people.
Okay, well, you know what? I'm changing my list for you based on guys. So let's try yours out here. I'm changing it right now.
Oh, the Marcos I would have kept. That much to Guy's surprise, by the way. Much to Guy's surprise.
That's funny. All right, so here are your 3. You get, all right, let me get this right here. Well, now you're making me change them even more. All right, so I'm going to change it here. Your first one's an Alpine A110.
Okay.
Nice little French car. Your second one is the TVR Griffith.
Okay.
Now, see, all of these are going to have over 400 made, probably. And then your third one is going to be the first-gen Ferrari 308 fiberglass.
I pitched that. What is that called? The 308
it's like a
sold.
Ventisa.
Yeah, no, I've seen it before. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be the one to sell. I don't know what they go for. And the other two, I would crush the TVR.
Oh.
Yeah, I'd crush the TV. The other one is interesting. Well, there's a lot of TVRs out there. All the TVR guys would actually, if I would crush the TVR, there's all become more expensive, right? So they would all, they'd
So
all
you're
take
doing
me.
them a favor by crushing their favorite car.
I hate to be the good guy all the time, yeah. but the interesting thing about the Alpine thing is Willis made the same damn car in Brazil. Are you familiar with that, called the Interlagos?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure if Guy is, but the Alpine, very racy car, was done down in Brazil called the Interlagos. And I couldn't believe it says Willis Interlagos. That would be the one I would keep. That's the super rare one.
Yeah, we
But
actually
it's-
had one of those
yeah.
at an auction recently, one of the South American ones, which is pretty cool.
Very, very rare and very interesting name, and it's rare that a car. But anyway, those are the TDR Griffith. I would choose to make all the other TDR Griffiths more expensive by crushing it.
I'm doing you a favor. Yeah. Well, I did have a Corvette in there, a C2 Corvette, but I had to yank that quickly because there's like thousands of those. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, guys. As a reminder, you can check out Guy's car at rmsotheby's.com right now. And then if you want to check out more Undiscovered Classics, go to undiscoveredclassics.com. And thanks, guys, for your time today.
Thanks, Greg.
Super. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to the Collector Car Podcast. Don't forget to give us a nice rating on iTunes and be sure to follow us on Instagram and everywhere else at the Collector Car Podcast.